Good day. In my previous video, I explained the problems that I was having with power in my house, the fact that the electricity system here has almost collapsed following some kind of a power surge in the area, and I'm afraid the situation as of this morning is no better. I would just say that I do have some internet power, and this is the basis upon which I'm doing this video. As you can all see, the conditions remain, well, shall we say, less than ideal. I can only apologise, but that's the best I can do at the moment. Anyway, let's move on and discuss where we are in this conflict in Ukraine, which is, as I said, for some time now, it's become the main topic of this channel. We have reports that this morning, no less a person than President Putin himself, accompanied by his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and his defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, are heading to Minsk, that they're going to have a big meeting there with the Belarus leadership. Now, what exactly is going on? What the purpose of this meeting is? The first instance, by the way, that Putin has visited Minsk for some years. I don't know. We will have to see. But everybody, of course, assumes, almost certainly rightly, that it is connected with the conflict in Ukraine. Now, that is, as I said, undoubtedly true, but I'm sure that in addition, Putin, Shoigu, and Lavrov will also be discussing the various plans for economic and military and political integration with Ukraine, which have been moving forward at accelerating speed ever since the 2020-2021 crisis, when there was a color revolution attempt in Belarus, which failed, and which failed in part because of Russian support for the Belarus government and for President Lukashenko personally. So they may be talking about some of that, but the fact that Lavrov is going and the fact that Shoigu, the defense minister, is also going, surely must point to some kind of foreign policy, military initiative, perhaps, as I said, almost certainly, in fact, connected to the war in Ukraine. Now, I will have to wait and see and get full reports about the meeting and what was discussed. We'll see the various readouts. We'll see the nature of the discussions before I comment further about this particular report. There's also, by the way, some reports circulating that next week the military collegium of the Ministry of Defense is in Russia, is also meeting. Now, this is, if you like, the board of the Ministry of Defense. It brings all the important people who work within the defense ministry's apparatus, and they will be meeting, and apparently Putin will be attending this meeting as well, which is an interesting development, and it follows from that series of meetings that we discussed and which took place last week. First, the meeting of the Security Council, Russia's top policy-making body, which happened on Thursday. Then Putin's visit to what is called the Joint Staff Headquarters of the forces operating in the special military operation. In other words, the body in overall charge, the military command of the in charge of the overall war in Ukraine, headed by General Surovikin, and I discussed that visit, which took up the entirety of Friday, in a video, which I did on Friday. Then we had the this follow-up meeting to Minsk, with Putin going to Minsk and meeting Lukashenko and his officials, and bringing Shoigu and Lavrov with him. And then apparently we're going to have a further meeting of the entire military leadership of Russia in the format of the Collegium of the Ministry of Defense. So, A lot is being talked about, a lot is being planned, many discussions are taking place. This looks like a very, very carefully prepared series of steps that are being taken, a very important series of meetings, all of which, as I said, to me, overwhelmingly focus on the war in Ukraine. All of the important people are being briefed. Probably, by the way, one of the reasons why Putin is traveling to Minsk and is going to meet with Lukashenko in person is because the Russians do not want to communicate electronically or by telephone or whatever with the Belarus leadership. They probably want to inform the Belarus leadership privately of some of the decisions made in the meetings on Thursday and Friday at the Security Council and the joint headquarters, and probably they are also going to invite some of these Belarus officials to participate in that meeting of the military collegium, which apparently is due to take place sometime over the course of this week. So I have to say, it does look like a series of planning meetings, a series of war councils, if you like, all pointing to something very big coming. And I come back to a point that I made a short time ago. Given the tight schedule, given the fact that Putin is holding all of these meetings and traveling to Minsk at this time and doing all these things, it is completely unsurprising that he has postponed his big press conference to the new year and also his address to the Federal Assembly. There's still, incredibly, some attempts in the media to talk up that issue, to pretend that there's some issue here of Putin avoiding questions, when in fact the facts, Putin's itinerary, the fact that he's moving to Minsk, making these, going to Minsk, having all of these meetings, tells us that he's got far more important things on his agenda than holding a press conference. And whilst I'm on that topic, I have to just talk about briefly the excitement that there has been about the fact that Russia has, the Russian Ministry of Defense has provided film of a Russian intercontinental ballistic missile of the Yars family being either deployed or launched from a silo. I'm not sure which, I haven't seen the film. And there's lots of talk about, this is somehow the Russians making all kinds of threats and warnings and things of that nature. And some people are linking it with the anticipated announcement of the Patriot delivery to Ukraine. Can I just say, this is a non-story. If you go to the website of the Russian Ministry of Defense, if you follow their various YouTube channels, such as them as still exist, if you go, some of them do, by the way, and if you go to their Telegram channel as well, you will know that the Russian Ministry of Defense regularly, routinely displays intercontinental ballistic missiles and weapon systems and that sort of thing, these sort of weapon systems. There is nothing unusual about the fact that the Russians are showing off one of their intercontinental ballistic missiles. I don't think it's intended as any kind of threat or warning or anything, actually. It's just something the Russians routinely do. So that's the situation. As I said, the political situation, as I said, Putin holding a whole series of very important meetings with his military leaders and meeting Lukashenko and Belarus's military leaders and bringing Shoigu and Lavrov with him. And we also have had more reports now of a massive drone attack on Ukraine. Now, this has come a couple of days after a missile strike on Ukraine, which is apparently a very, very damaging missile strike. Indeed, did apparently enormous amount of damage. A couple of hours later, about 2 days later in fact, the Ukrainian officials in Kiev said that power had been restored to the city, but now it seems that following this latest drone attack, power is off again. So we see how the Russians are going back to their old formula: missile strikes followed by drone attacks, followed by more missile strikes. And by the way, the pressure of all of this is a good sign that the pressure of all of this is beginning to be felt in a whole succession of rather interesting comments from Ukrainian officials. Interesting because they do look at this precise moment in time as frankly somewhat detached from reality. So we had an interview in which President Zelensky said that the operation to recover Crimea has already started, except it's no actual physical step has been taken. It's all in the mind, apparently. Doesn't mean that there's even planning about it. I mean, what Zelensky was talking about was that people in Ukraine are now being psychologically prepared, are becoming psychologically prepared for the fact that Ukraine is going to recapture Crimea. So that was Zelensky. Then we've had Danilov, the Secretary of the Security Council, Ukraine Security Council, coming out with further comments about how Russia is again supposedly running out of missiles. They have only enough for 4 big missile strikes apparently, and then after that, well, they finally run out and they can't launch any more, except that Danilov did say that since they wouldn't let themselves get into that situation, the Russians would, of course, hold some missiles back. Then we've had more comments from Zelensky saying that the civilian population of Kiev will not be evacuated because doing so would leave Kiev deserted, which might make it easier for the Russians to capture and occupy it. I find that, by the way, both a disturbing perspective, one which basically says that people there in a city are needed to shield the city from occupation. It comes very close to saying that the civilian population of a city is in effect a human shield, something which the Russians have been accusing the Ukrainians of right throughout this war. But anyway, putting that aside, it does also suggest to me an extraordinary indifference to the civilian population, obviously, but also genuine concern that an attack, a strike on Kiev is indeed coming. Otherwise, why say that you need the civilian population there so that the Russians find it more difficult to capture and occupy it? Anyway, that's one further comment of Zelensky's. And now he's followed up with more comments to the effect that the only guarantee Ukraine is prepared to give is that when Putin is handed over for punishment to Ukraine, his life will be spared. So, whole series of really rather dramatic comments from Zelensky and his officials, all of which are not out of character, it must be said, but all of which seem to me to be intended to suggest that, Ukraine is still there, it's still fighting, he's still fighting, the war goes on, he's not giving up, he's making all these extraordinary statements, but at this precise moment in time, they do look rather delusional. And I would say there is a contrast between the behavior of the two leaders. You see Putin methodically meets with his Security Council, with Surovikin and his staff, with Lukashenko and his staff, with the military collegium. He prepares his steps carefully and methodically and systematically. And of course Zelensky instead prefers to give interviews to The Economist, to the Ukrainian media, and to make speeches and statements of this rather strange, at least to my mind, rather strange kind. So what's actually happening on the battlefields? Well, there's been quite a lot of interesting news, and I am going to actually directly read from some of the Russian reports. These are Russian reports from one of the Russian telegram channels, Slavyangrad. Let me stress again, it gives a Russian take on the war. So, Ukrainians, no doubt, would take issue with much of what is said there. But having said that, as I've said, I in the past have found Slavyangrad reliable, and I would also add that it can be sometimes very critical of the Russian political and military leadership. So I would say all of that. So take this all with, a certain amount of, pinch of salt. But for what it's worth, I think this probably does give us a reasonable picture of what is going on. So on the topic of Marinka, last night, they published this comment. Tonight we received information that after weeks of fighting, the army of the Donetsk People's Republic were able to crush the enemy in the center of Marinka, and were finally able to take control of the last southern central enemy stronghold in the high-rise area. Given that at the same time our troops are attacking Pobjeda and are well entrenched in the northern parts of Marinka, opposite Krasnogorovka. Now, as I said, when they said our troops, of course they mean the Russian troops, there can be no enemy counterattack, which means that after mopping up the town, which may take several days, Marinka will be entirely under our troops' control, Russian troops' control, after which it will be time to resume the offensive against Vuhledar. And then they go on to say, in this particular dispatch, that after Vuhledar, after Pobjeda and Vuhledar, another potential target is another town called Konstantinovka in Donetsk, the Donetsk region, which remains still under Ukrainian control. And then they have also provided a further report about the situation in and around Bakhmut. And they say that Wagner organization units continue to push through enemy positions south of, I'm going to call it Bakhmut. They call it Artyomovsk, but I'm going to call it Bakhmut, with the obvious intention of eventually reaching the village of Ivanivska and cutting off the main supply lines of the enemy grouping in Bakhmut. And then they go on to say that battles continue in Opitnoye, and that Kleshchevka has now been reached. And they say fierce fighting for Opitnoye has been going on for the second week, and so far the Ukrainians have not been fully driven out of the village, although most of the village is under Russian control. The offensive on Kleshchevka began a little later. A few days ago, groups of Wagner soldiers knocked out the Ukrainians in their position to the south of this village, capturing several important strongholds. I've heard, by the way, that the railway station in this particular village has been reached. And then yesterday, that's to say Sunday, the Wagner units succeeded in breaking through to Kleshchevka's railway station, and in doing so managed to get hold of the residential area of the village from the northeast direction. And the enemy is seized in pincers, but realizing the importance of Kleshchevka, they desperately continue to hold their ground and even try to counterattack, but without success. So that's one Russian account of the state of the fighting near Bakhmut. They're talking increasingly of the major routes into Bakhmut being finally taken control of. This has been an ongoing thing for some time, for the Russians continuing to make advances in those areas. And this morning, more reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense at a place called Yakovenka. Not quite sure where that is, by the way. Another important village. I mean, these are villages or small towns in Donetsk. They're not big places, but they are places which the Ukrainians have been holding on to very determinedly because they lie on crossroads or roads and things like that, and their capture undermines Ukrainian positions in other places. Well, the Russian Ministry of Defense is now claiming that Yakovenka has been captured, though separately from that and from the other side, we're getting also reports that the Ukrainians are heavily reinforcing their grouping in a place called Chasov Yar, where perhaps some of the headquarters of the troops that are still fighting in Bakhmut have been relocated. There was a report to that effect, I think, way back in September. But anyway, apparently there are more Ukrainian troops now gathering there, and there are some suggestions that these troops may be intended, they may be earmarked for a counteroffensive, perhaps to relieve the pressure on Bakhmut. Ukraine launches many counterattacks. It's one of the natures of this battle. It's one of the things that makes this battle for Bakhmut so relentless and fierce. These counterattacks, as far as I can see, have never succeeded. What they have done instead is cause Ukraine to suffer, the Ukrainian army to suffer very, very heavy casualties. Now, yesterday, I said that I'd seen a report, I'd seen photographs of trenches that Ukrainian soldiers are building in the center of Bakhmut, and perhaps in response to that, there was a report that appeared yesterday, later in the day, which I read in the Daily Telegraph, that the Russians, for their part, are building fortifications in Melitopol. This is the city in, I believe it's actually Zaporozhye region, which the Russians captured early in the war, and which is an important hub for communications land communications between Russia and Crimea, and land communications between the Russians and their forces in eastern Kherson region. We've heard a lot about these plans for an offensive by the Ukrainians to march all the way to the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, and that would obviously require the capture of Melitopol, and General Zaluzhny has talked about it. Ukrainians are talking, the Ukrainian officials have variously talked about it. It's appeared in the media, though in The Economist just a few days ago, General Zaluzhny was saying that he didn't have the necessary forces to carry out an offensive of that kind. Anyway, this report about the Russians building fortifications in Melitopol, as it appeared in the Daily Telegraph, it might have been published to counter the impression of the trenches that the Ukrainians are building in the center of Bakhmut. Those, by the way, look a rather slapdash affair. Having said that, despite the fact that this is a Ukrainian report without any photographic or other such evidence to corroborate it, I would not be surprised if it were true. It seems to me that it is very much in Surovikin's character to fortify vulnerable locations wherever they may be, even if they are well behind the front lines. He seems to be the sort of person who prefers to do things in advance rather than have to do them in a hurry and do them in a slapdash way if things turn out unexpectedly or badly for him in that particular area. So I'm inclined to believe this story. And as I said, I would suggest that again, it's very characteristic of the approach General Surovikin is taking to this war. He takes a position, he fortifies it, he brings in civilian contractors. The fortifications are very elaborate. Maybe they're not Maginot Line level of complexity, but they're pretty elaborate for field fortifications built over a course of a few weeks. Civilian contractors are brought in, materials from Russia are brought in, a lot of hard work is done, and it all looks like Russian positions are being hardened up just about everywhere, something which, however, is not inconsistent, or does not appear to be inconsistent, with Surovikin planning some kind of offensive at the same time. So we have a lot of that sort of thing going on. And I've also, by the way, read on various, one particular channels, Slavyangrad, as it happens, about certain changes that the Russians are making to their military, the military organization of their field units. There was a long piece, some of it I didn't find interesting, and some of it I found rather emotional. But it did say that there's been a significant reorganization of the battalion tactical group, which the Russians in the past, over the last couple of years, have been making the main combat unit of the Russian field army. And this unit numbers around 500 to 800 men, as I understand it. The conclusion has been that it is over heavy in heavy weapons, tanks, artillery, that sort of thing, and it doesn't have adequate infantry, and that infantry, there need to be more infantry attached to these battalion tactical groups in order to make them better able to protect their flanks. And this article then goes on to say that a lot of the mobilized troops who have already been deployed to the battlefields have been trained as infantry to basically strengthen the infantry component in these battalion tactical groups. Now, of course, I don't know whether this is true, but I'm sure it is. The article did seem to be very well resourced, and I have to say, if so, it corroborates a very interesting article made by the Canadian academic Paul Robinson, who is not only a very fine academic on Russian matters, but who, as a former British Army officer, I find writes interestingly about war. And Paul Robinson has made a point which I think is correct, which is that overall, despite many claims to the contrary, the face of war has not changed as much as many people, including myself, by the way, had imagined. War still relies on infantry, tanks, artillery, those sort of things. Obviously, these have been developed to a much higher level than was before, but given that in any war situation, the other side, in a peer conflict, is able to balance whatever advances one side has achieved with equally advanced tanks, artillery, infantry fighting vehicles, and the rest. Overall, war is basically as it has been, is fought in much the same way as it has been, well, basically since the Second World War. And I think that is true. And it does perhaps, for those of us who are rather in awe of technological change, it does perhaps give some insight into how, in some ways, technological change has been less rapid than we imagine. Anyway, I found it an interesting article. Now, there's been, again, a flurry of articles in the Western media about the state of the war. I do get the sense, as I said, that there is much less optimism about it than there was. The New York Times, by the way, is in the process of telling us about all of the great Ukrainian victories that were achieved at the start of the war and how the Russians failed at the start of the war. I don't really see much value in going over all that again, but anyway, that's what they're doing. There has been one interesting piece, and it's in a website magazine which I would say manages to remain mainstream, though from a conservative perspective, but perhaps is becoming less mainstream than it was. Once upon a time, it would have been considered very mainstream indeed. Anyway, that is the American Conservative, and it's a fine piece by George O'Neill, and it starts with a picture of a devastated street in Ukraine and says, "Is this winning?" question mark. And he goes on to say that Western leaders can no longer hide the truth about Ukraine. And he then goes on to talk about the tremendous losses that Ukraine has suffered. And he says the mainstream media and the Biden administration insist all ad nauseum that Ukraine is winning against Russia, but the facts on the ground do not fit the narrative, and the administration and media know it. The war hawks know their cynical Ukraine policy has not succeeded in driving Russia out of Ukraine. Tragically, the Ukrainians are the ones who suffer the immense cost of this foreign policy failure. Their nation is ruined for the sake and at the instigation of, well, it goes on to talk about the United States, and then it talks about the fighting in Bakhmut and how that battle is not going well for Ukraine. It then talks about how Ukraine has lost already around 20% of its territory. That's, by the way, there's some arguments about how much territory the Russians do occupy. It talks about the vast numbers of Ukrainian refugees. It talks about the enormous damage done to Ukraine's infrastructure, the energy crisis there. It talks about the fact that the Ukrainian economy is contracted by around a third in 2022. That, by the way, is definitely an underestimate. It goes on to talk at length about how I'll read it here. The recent victory of Ukraine capturing Kherson has evaporated. Ukraine is evacuating Kherson due to Russian shelling. The Ukrainian military machine is unable to maintain control over a city their opponent has evacuated. All the September and October Ukrainian offensives have stalled, and the Russians appear to be solidifying their lines of defense and dramatically increasing their forces in the field, whilst Ukraine is drafting 60-year-old men. I agree with that. That is, as far as I can see, all true. And then it goes on to say that Ukraine is also losing its access to the resources it needs to continue. And then it talks about how weapon systems, that the West is finding it difficult to keep up with the West's supplies of weapon systems. And it refers to the CEO of Raytheon, who talks about how Ukraine has used 13 years of Javelin production in 10 months. So there are some people in the United States, and this person, George O'Neill, is a member of the board of directors of the American Ideas Institute, which publishes the American Conservative. And anyway, there are some people in the United States who do seem to have a genuine understanding of the condition, the state of the war. And one does hope, for Ukraine's sake, that these people will start to exert more leverage over the administration, over government policy in the United States. The Economist, the British newspaper, the magazine The Economist, which published all those interviews with all those Ukrainian officials, talked about the fact that the war in Ukraine is at a crossroads. And I agree. Though I would not agree with the conception of the crossroads that The Economist is advocating. The Economist seems to think that the choice is between, not helping Ukraine and helping Ukraine so that it can achieve victory. As far as I'm concerned, it is on the contrary, between coming to some kind of agreement that will stabilize peace in Europe, save something of Ukraine, and the alternative, a total debacle. A debacle that may take months, perhaps years, to work its way through, but a debacle nonetheless. But at least we agree that the war is indeed at a crossroads. Now, obviously, the key events are going to happen for the next couple of weeks and months on the battlefields. I see no sign that Ukraine is able to hold back the existing Russian offensive in Donbass. It seems to me that virtually everybody now accepts that sooner or later Bakhmut will fall and that the Russians will capture Bakhmut and that they will probably capture all of these other places. I'm not a military person. I'm not going to argue about that consensus. I would simply say to those who make the point that it has taken the Russians months to capture Bakhmut, that is true, but at what cost to Ukraine? Anyway, so if Ukraine cannot capture Bakhmut, cannot defend Bakhmut, if it does look like its positions in places like Vuhledar are also going to start getting under severe pressure and may perhaps collapse within the next, well, I'm not going to estimate time periods. And if it is indeed the case that 160,000 fresh Russian troops, reorganized and retrained in new units, are heading for the battlefield, and if it is indeed the case that Surovikin is building all of these fortifications, making it more and more problematic and difficult for Ukraine to launch offensives, and if it is indeed the case that the West is struggling to keep up with Ukraine's voracious demands for weapons supplies, and if it is also the case, finally, that the Ukrainian energy system and railway system are coming under unbearable pressure, that life in Ukrainian cities is becoming extremely difficult, and that the condition of Ukraine, in effect, is deteriorating. Well, surely all of this needs to be put together, and people need to start thinking, perhaps more realistically than they have been doing up to now. And I'm referring now to the proposals for a peace settlement that have come out of people like Kissinger and Olaf Scholz. Maybe the time has come for all of these people to start looking at this situation more realistically and coming up with more coherent proposals. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say today. I'm afraid, as I said, the fragile condition of my internet makes me nervous about doing longer programs. I hope, as I say, I'm due a visit from an engineer later today. I hope that things will be back to normal soon, but in the meantime, I do what I can. And I thank you for bearing with me. And in the meantime, I would remind you that you can find all our programs on our other channels, on platforms rather, on Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and Rockfin. That you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. That you can find great things in our shop, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, all of those great things. And last but not least, If you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.